Hello, my name is Rebecca Howland, and I work at the Fincher Museum of Fine Art as a museum educator. I am here with Eric Standley, who is going to be talking about his art pieces, his process, and some more details. Currently, Eric's work is displayed in the Fincher Museum of Art of Paper exhibit, which will be up until January 8th, 2022. Before we get started on discussing his artwork, I wanted to delve into his background a bit. Eric is a professor of studio art for the School of Visual Arts at Virginia Tech, where he teaches laser cutting and engraving techniques. He received his BFA from Massachusetts College of Arts and his MFA from Savannah College of Art and Design. Most of his work consists of complex paper cut art using vector-based software and CNC, known as computer numerical control lasers. So is there anything that you would like to add regarding your background that might help set the scene for talking about your art?
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Rebecca.
Yeah, no problem.
So being a professor at Virginia Tech has worked out very well for me, mainly because of its occupation with technology related to the arts. We're really lucky to have the technology to continue a highly effective education at the university. And I'm grateful to be able to, work with the facilities that are around me. Virginia Tech has, I work personally with about 4 lasers at the university. I also have my own laser in the studio right behind us. In all of this, it's not like I just set out and said, yeah, I want a laser and I'm going to start cutting paper. It was a long path to get there. And Virginia Tech was certainly a big part of ending up with the work that I'm doing now. So my path as an artist really started at a young age, basically following a compulsion to discover and create. I probably drove my parents crazy unless I had a pencil in my hand, and that was like my pacifier. But I could draw from life, I could draw people, and my parents recognized that this wasn't quite normal. So they supported me. They put me in classes and summer camps, partially to just occupy my time and not drive them crazy, and partially out of a recognition that this was how I was made. So really being an artist for me is as necessary as breathing. I feel lucky to have a purpose in the world, but I do have to credit that I was lucky. My parents supported this, and I really didn't make the choice to be an artist. It was just what I am wired to do. So another aspect that might be interesting here is I grew up in a family of engineers. And the motivational difference between artists and engineers is really quite slight. My father was an engineer, my grandfather, and all my brothers were engineers. While they were all intrinsically curious about how something functioned and how a function could be improved, I was always the one to ask, mostly jokingly, why something functioned and what that function might communicate if it was done differently. And I really came at those things sarcastically because I just didn't think like my father and my brothers. But come to find out later in our careers, we have a lot of similarities. We have a lot of things that we look at in a similar way from an engineering and artistic standpoint. So it's nice. So really as a young person, my imagination was always at the forefront of everything I did. And as a kid, I just could not go through the world without questioning or goofing around in a way that was about discovering something or pioneering something new. And this was coupled with my obsession to draw and paint. So as I said, my parents supported my artistic pursuits like K through 12 and all the way into college. But the truth is, it was all I had. I didn't really have a backup. And ironically, I could not imagine doing something that did not include using my imagination. So I was kind of locked in to the field from a young age.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. So now that we know a little bit about your background, a little bit more about your process and how you got into what you do now, can I ask you to delve more into your process in making these pieces? We can start with the similarity of opposites first, since it has a unique duality different from your other pieces. It's very unique.
Yeah, ideally, this piece should be displayed in a weightless, reflective environment. I had just taken on a commission and I committed myself to some concepts about tolerances and discovery, the actual concept of discovery. Now, when I start a project these days, I do a lot of what we used to call lateral thinking, where you look at the practicality of a solution and then you explore the exact opposite. And somehow that has become a common practice for me. And it does drive my wife crazy because when I take on a commission, I'm sort of obligated to this job, and this particular commission I'm referring to, I'm just finishing. It's about a year-long commission. Right from the beginning, I'm going off track. I'm thinking of the opposite of what this thing is going to be. So similarity of opposites is a result of the opposite of where this commission was. It's sort of almost like the negative space, a little bit of staging and practicing different techniques, but mostly it was motivated almost sarcastically out of where I was heading. So really nothing goes unquestioned when I do these things, and the similarity of opposites was created basically out of a practice of questioning. And one of the big questions was, how would a self-similar object exist in a weightless environment? And what if that environment were completely reflective? So as I made this, I was already in trouble. I couldn't even hold the thing. All the surfaces sort of reflect one another somewhat in opposite, but the similarity of those opposites, there's always differences. And then if this were reflected again in an outward way, what would that be? What would that be like? So it was a fun piece. It was really sarcastically motivated, including its complexity that seems to be always in the back of my mind. The complexity that we witness in the world is, I don't know, it's so infinitely amusing to me, that no matter how detailed we think and go, there's always more. So I don't know why that's entertaining to me, but it is.
Right, and then you have the mirrors. It kind of shows like the infinite reflection of the piece kind of repeating. It's an interesting concept. So.
Yeah, I'm so happy you guys were able to display it like you did, because it was only a concept, and I talked to Courtney, I think it was Courtney. I says, can you put this on a mirror? Can we try to do this? And she said, yeah, sure, we can do that.
Yeah. And it is, when people come in and they see it, it's very, it's not only three-dimensional, but then you have to look fully down, diagonal. It's like four-dimensional at that point. So it's
yeah, I love that. And I love that, you have to look down to look up. And I imagine in some cases that the observer is in the field of vision while investigating, all of these things. I don't know. I think they're quite interesting to me, and I'm happy that this thing kind of grew out of a strange, sarcastic act.
Right. Yeah, because then when you do happen to see yourself in the mirror, it kind of reminds you that you're also in the same space and your experience is also part of the artwork as well. So it's very interesting. I love it when mirrors are involved in art pieces because of reasons like that. So it kind of breaks the fourth wall at that point. So,
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, it's staying with me. The mirror actually is staying with the commission piece I'm working on. So
oh, gotcha.
that's stuck. Yeah.
All right. So let's see. Next question. So I see that you draw inspiration from Ramen Lowell for your Lowell piece. Can you expand on that a little bit more? Or did you have any other artistic influences that you drew from your other pieces?
Yeah, for Lowell, I was thinking about empirical truth related to religious beliefs. And I always end up doing a lot of reading when I get on these bigger questions and concepts. And Ramon Lull was an interesting figure for me, historic figure. He was a mathematician and a philosopher from the 13th century. And he authored this book that outlined a mathematical system to discover absolute truth. Like he thought he had nailed it, that he had it figured out, that the ultimate truth can be mathematically arrived at. I never actually read the book. I kind of got the quote cliff notes, the concepts of it. And it is sort of this typical 13th century idea. And interestingly, it's at a time when the number zero was not employed in a more popular way. The idea that one was the largest number is a very 12th and 13th century concept. So that's where he's coming from. That one is the largest number, and all other numbers are a division of one. So the paradox that really interested me of Lull was that he was a devout Christian, and he took it upon himself to go east and spread the word of this sort of Christian religion to Islamic states and Muslim communities. And after about, I think it's like 11 or 12 years, he comes back and he has built this huge admiration for the integrity of the Muslim faith. He sort of almost converted himself in a reverse way. And I just thought that was a beautiful thing, especially somebody who's steadfast on nailing down truth. So the actual artwork was influenced by all of these thoughts. So all of my decisions on shapes and how those sort of aggressive arms leading back in, all relating to my interpretation of this paradox of Lull. The polarization top and bottom, perhaps being this sort of idea of faith, and then the central area of an actual faith, an actual non-dogmatic personal faith being in the middle. That's something else that it actually is another story there I could give you later, but about how every being has a need to investigate their own spirit. And that was what this center was. Also about this particular piece, there's no glue used for this work. Every layer of paper and every piece of wood is all fitted together using locking joints. Some of the joints are made out of paper. Others, they are sort of these locking pins made out of wood.
Yeah, when I look at the piece, once I looked into your background a bit on the Ramen Mole piece, um, the arms kind of like for me show like reaching out, like I want to show people Christianity, kind of like a crusade situation. But then it's interesting how it kind of comes back in, and he was like, I got to reevaluate myself, and he was able to learn and teach not only other people but himself in the end, which is, kind of ties back to that inner truth and like really looking for truth and not just kind of putting forth whatever. And so the fact that he was able to um, change, I wouldn't even say it's changing minds, but it's appreciative of both other religions too. So it's interesting how that develops. But
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we can only speculate,
right.
how that affected him, but as a historical figure, it definitely works um, in this stretching way, this sort of reach. So I'm going to share a story with you.
Okay, go for
I
it.
had an exhibit in Southwell, the Southwell Cathedral. I was invited to show a work at a show called Crossings, and I got to put a piece in the actual cathedral. And I actually did a piece called the Woe to the Vanquished that is a very Islamic influenced. And I thought that would be interesting in a cathedral in of itself. Anyway, Father Askey, who invited me, he was just a great person to work with, and he told me we got into a kind of a late night discussion about religion that scared all the other artists away from us, and he told me that faith is a mountain, in that we're all just people down at the foot, the circumference of the mountain, and we're all looking up from different ways, but we're all going the same place. Our faith is all pointing up, and he used the term God. We're all looking for God. We're all trying to relate our spiritual beings to some fixed point. But the point was that, we all get there from different places, and we might take different paths to get there. And I
Right.
really thought that was a beautiful story, that he gave me.
Yeah, this really puts it into perspective. You can visualize it a little bit more. So, um, all right. So, moving on to the next question. For your Verum artworks, Object 2 and 4, can you explain the connection you made with society and virtual changes with those?
Yeah. So the Verum objects were created out of that. My initial reaction to the physical distance we'd been asked to keep during the early part of COVID. We all have our experiences now from that, but for me, as an extrovert, it was deeply fatiguing, and teaching at a distance, and not being able to travel and talk as I normally do. It was tough. It was tough on me, and it started to make me think about what I do as an artist. I use technology. A lot of my drawing practice is done with vectors and vector software, and I'm using lasers to do the cutting. But I'm making objects. I like physical objects that are witnessed in physical space. I only make one object, even though I have all these files that they could probably be um, produced in multiple. But having that one object in the world, I don't know, it gives it an aura. It gives it something unique. And I like to think that when it's witnessed in its physical reality, that is an experience that goes beyond the screen or beyond an image. So of course, as we lived our lives through our screens for quite a while, it got me thinking about, the essence of our lives is really in our actions. And it's in the relationships we have with one another, the places we go, and the physical things that we observe. So the Verum objects were based on a phrase called, I just came up with, that was limited physicality is limited reality. And I use the word verum as it's a version of the word truth. But really I was using it as the opposite of virtual. So verum being present in truth and virtual being a mediation, like we're talking right now through a screen.
Right.
And it's going to be recorded. There's an additional mediation there, and we could go down the line. So witnessing the physical object and sharing space with that artifact suddenly became this sort of central theme that I had already been doing, but it was elevated because of how society had to change and adjust, and really for our own survival at the cost of this separation and kind of fatigue on the soul. So really the Verum objects, I can't remember what you guys have there. The Verum objects, they were really created out of an act of detoxification. They were built as antibodies to the existential void I was feeling at the time. So building them as fragile artifacts with paper, it wasn't something new, but it was a heightened awareness that I said, yeah, the Verum objects have to be fragile. They have to exist, and they have to be witnessed in person. Even when I document my work, it really falls short. And I'm usually pretty generous. I'll give away any image of my work because it's not the thing. You have to experience these pieces in person.
Right. Yeah, we have the one, I believe object 2 is the one that looks like a lot of the kids, when they would come in, they think it looks like a star, or like the hull of a ship, like the wheel. It's interesting because when I think of that, it makes me think of hope. And when you think of, you're kind of worried because you're isolated from people, but this, to steer the ship, you still have control to be able to get out of a storm. And then a star, you use it to guide your way. So they're kind of like guiding tools in a sense. And it was interesting how the kids kind of made that connection for me. And I was like, well, maybe you're right. Maybe it is like a star or a wheel. So
yeah, that is beautiful. Yeah, that's really nice. Yeah, that particular piece, a lot of the motivation was to line up these physical objects in space, but have that central part protrude into the viewing area. I mean, it's almost like I couldn't design something any more difficult to document, but that's where I end up being. So I do like that when you can recognize it as a star or some sort of symmetrical object from the front, and then as you get to the side, you see that its occupation is in space. But what's nice about working with technologies, I can line up all of these layers almost in a flat space on a screen, and then assemble them in such a way that they can occupy depth, but still line up from one particular perspective.
Right. Definitely interesting pieces there. So on to the next question. With your Padovia piece, which is personally, I think, one of my favorites, how does like one's environment and fragility relate with it?
It's such an awesome question. We could spend a couple days, Rebecca, on that one. Let me just start with the simple motivation behind Padovia. Padovia it's an altered interpretation of the Padovian sequence, which is a fractal developed by a mathematician in Princeton University. I liked his work. So this piece really was motivated out of that self-similar fractal, and I altered it, and then I started to push it into space in certain ways that it wasn't like I was going to maintain that fractal in space, but that, you know, that idea that this work could function on a micro and a macro level was part of the fun of it for me, the journey. And this particular piece was the piece that motivated all of the color field, the wall activation behind the piece, because I wanted to have that shape be the next step. If, you know, as this fractal increases in size, what would be the next step? And that size is the next step. And as I'm developing the work, my mind is often thinking about color and how certain colors will amplify what. So I already had a shape and a color signifier out there. I'm like, how can I get this in there? And it just worked out well that having that occupy a certain space and also give a buffer, kind of a rest for the eye as you look at it around the actual detailed work. It gave that micro macro presence. So then I started doing it with all of the work, and actually this year was the first time I released those things. It was in my solo show in New York, and your museum is really the second time they've been done this way, and I'm really thankful that you guys went for it and painted your walls.
We are too. It's a nice contrast, because I believe you even had contrasting colors, so it really tied it in well without being too overwhelming. It had a nice play off of each other. And you mentioned the microscopic details and the versus the macro, and Padovia specifically is so detailed. Like the smallest little bends of paper, and every time I see that, I think of, like, you know, being in isolation during COVID, and you think you might not have as much effect as one person, but just being that one little fold. And if somebody else also is like that one little fold, you can build something really beautiful and complex and kind of coexist, you know, while still having that connection, even if you can't physically. So it's a very beautiful piece, definitely.
Thank you. That was well said. That's good. Yeah, I had been influenced by, I was on a grant team with a biophysicist and an entomologist who were working with chromatin packing in DNA. And so they asked me to be on their grant team because they work in a field that is nearly impossible to articulate or to create images of. And they were looking for a way, they were looking for metaphors for that kind of complexity. So anyway, it was a fun grant to be on. And I created a lot of work, but a couple of years later, I get to Padovia and Lull and all these other pieces, and that experience had really influenced me, that something as delicate as how our DNA is folded to express how a biological being will develop into the future, and also how those expressions can be changed within a lifetime and then within generations, and then species, so forth. So it had this micro macro conversation in a whole different level, like a different dimension. So from an atomic level up to a astrological level, it really impacts me. So I think that's what came through with the work you're seeing, that experience really led to that.
Right. It definitely comes through. It's for sure. Most people can stand there for a solid 5 minutes just looking to kind of go through each corner, and then they're like, oh my, there's more. So keeps the brain busy, the eyes busy, all of it. So
yeah, I like to think that with these pieces, even though they're static, there's always something to discover. I mean, even for me, and I'm making them, taking some time to investigate the work, there's always something new, a different perspective. If the lighting is different, your mood, whatever it might be, the work basically is reflecting the dynamic nature of the viewer. So whatever you bring to it, or how much time you spend with it, it's not going to be the same any 2 or 3 visits.
right. And even like if you go through certain experiences in life too, maybe you come back or your environment's changed, you've grown older, sometimes I would get that when I would view like artists' work that I used to look at back in my bachelor or my graduate degree, and I come back to it and I'm like, was that there? Did I see that?
Right.
So particularly there's one, it's Francisco Goya's was it Saturn devouring his son. I used to be like so repulsed with that, and then I learned a little bit more about him and how he like had it at his dinner table, and it kind of grew to this quirky thing that, and kind of partially a idea that, hey, maybe I should put that at my dining table and then nobody would want to come over. So it's just interesting how like there's maybe some pieces, or even that you might not like and you might like later, some pieces you might like and then you might change your mind. So it's interesting how your perspective could change. So
Oh yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
Well, the bigger part of that question that I sidestepped, how did you say it? How does one's environment and fragility relate to the work? That's like close to my artist statement. That the one thing that we have in common as not just humans, but as life forms is our fragility. And for me, reflecting that fragility is a way to motivate compassion, that, we're not permanent. And every moment with another person or another being is something special. It's a strange blink of an eye in the giant spectrum of time. So that fragility to me is kind of a ongoing key component to my work.
Right. Or even the fact that you use paper, you never know if paper is fragile or not. It just depends on its shape and form and how you use it. So as a tree, it can last years, hundreds of years, but as like a tissue paper, probably not. So kind of interesting how you can take it from the physical aspect to the mental aspect in that case. So all right. So next question. So where is your most recent work taking you? And have you pursued any new mediums lately, or has the recent developments with COVID changed your approach on how you create art as of lately?
So my most recent piece that will be completed in probably about 4 days. It's called The Currency of Tolerances, and it's a commission that started last February. So it's a long-term piece, and I've done other work in between to inform it, including the similarity of opposites. But this is really bringing me further into not just a physical space that's off the wall and freestanding, but also investigating the elements of internal and external surfaces as a metaphor for internal and external awareness or consciousness. So this piece has, it has an interior, and it can be seen from the outside by peeking into or through some of the other details. So that's really where I'm heading, and it's motivated some concepts that I'll be working on shortly. The idea of medium, actually, let me address, because I've already addressed it a bit. Of course, the influence of society and our environment it's always it's a part of a dynamic undulation of how I process my own thoughts. The Verum Objects, of course, completely raising awareness of my reality related to a physical world. So that's just always going to happen. I don't really have a this steadfast scaffolding that I stick to. I remain pretty flexible in a lot of ways to my environment and outside influences. However, the medium of paper is still just really interesting to me. Paper it's like a language. They're both, paper and language are both vehicles for thought. They deliver a concept in a message, and humbly so. Maybe language less so. There's classism in language. I guess there's classism in paper as well, but there is mannerisms of thought that can be collected and delivered in language and on paper. And paper has been doing this for thousands of years. And it's been this sort of humble messenger, really recording some of our most precious thoughts in the Quran, in the Bible, and so forth. Paper is sort of the forgotten hero that delivers humanity's most important works. I also like its fragility. And years ago, when I started cutting paper by hand, and then I moved to a laser, I started to stack the layers and think about paper as a very thin slice of physical space. So it acts like it's a 2D surface, but it's actually physical. And when you stack those 2D environments on top of one another enough times, the negative space of the cuts become 3-dimensional. And that's just, I don't know, I love that shift from 2D to 3D. There's something just beautiful about that act. I love the vulnerability of the paper. It reminds me of a life form in of itself. And at the same time, it's reliable. It passes through generations. It's almost like DNA. It goes beyond our physical selves, and it's passed on into next generations, next civilizations, for that matter.
Right. It's interesting. You were talking about the different thinnesses and it taking space, and I was just curious, are you experimenting with any other types of paper, like thinner paper, thicker paper, fibrous paper, or you've been kind of staying with the same type that you use as of lately?
Yeah, constantly. Um, I have a big collection. You can't really see it. Over there, there's up there. I have a huge collection of paper. Whenever I travel, I bring back papers. So especially from the Middle East, I've collected a lot of. They still make handmade paper there, and
Oh, wow.
it's pretty great to get these physical spaces. You know, these 2D but 3D spaces that I can incorporate into my layers. Now, some of them I'm cautious to use because they're not. Some of the handmade papers are not pH balanced, and I stick to archival pieces, especially like the work you have and the commission I'm doing. But every once in a while, I'll get a decent mulberry or rice paper that's pH balanced, and I can sneak it in there. So yeah, I love the differences of paper.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I was thinking about it. We just recently installed Joneson's Crazy About Art exhibition, and she uses origami, and she uses like Gampi paper and some other specific paper she finds just in Japan. And it's fascinating how huge of a difference it is from just regular copy paper. And you never really think about how the slight differences in the same material but different material it could make in the work, and how much more better quality, how it could last longer, be more fragile. So it's interesting, and I thought I would ask you that question as well. So
yeah, it's like many origami artists who focus on paper where the fibers are made to survive and hold a fold, and suddenly this paper is sought after and becomes ideal. I have a similar kind of quest with laser cut paper, because different papers react differently when you laser cut them. And I have my particular laser for my studio. It's made specifically to cut paper. So I use a much thinner frequency beam in this particular laser, and I'm using a wattage that's relative to cutting paper. So I'm able to cut things very accurately. I mean, ridiculously accurately. But half of it's a two-way street. The other half of it is, how is the paper and the fibers in that paper going to respond to a laser cut? So a lot of the paper that I use ends up being fairly high rag content, but the recycled papers, interestingly, there is some polyester in there that preserves the color of the paper. So when I cut with these certain papers, the profile of that cut, the very edge where the beam had cut through, that color is brighter than the surface of the paper, because it kind of cauterizes the cut as it goes, and there's no burn.
It's interesting.
So I collect those, once I get on those particular papers, just like an origami artist, I'm like, oh, these papers are important to me because they function perfectly for this particular technique.
Yeah, you were just talking about that. I'm like, and lasers, you don't really make the connection. It's very hot temperature wise, so it's like you want to make sure you also pick a paper that's not just going to combust into flames, I'm sure. So have you ever had that happen before, or no?
Yeah.
Oh god.
but really, the settings, these machines, or the particular machines that I use, I have such control over the power and the speed. Between power and speed, going over the surface of a sheet of paper. I mean, I can engrave into the surface of tissue paper. You know, I can control the settings to that degree. So finding the optimum cut setting for different papers is, well, it's kind of fun, but you know, you have to be sensitive to it. You know, it's, of course you're going to cut through it, but how do you cut through it with, you know, doing the least amount of damage to the paper and maintaining the most amount of color and accuracy with the cut? So those have become kind of central, geeky, technical aspects to my work.
Right. Oh, that's awesome. That's great to know. It's just interesting how questions kind of pop into your head and things you don't think about until you're discussing it. So,
Right.
so yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to discuss your artwork with everyone here at the Pearl. I wanted to ask, where can we find more information about your work and upcoming exhibitions, and just to stay updated?
Yeah, you can see most of my work on my website, ericstanley.com. I've been posting my process on Instagram under my name these days as well, just because the process for me is such a, it's a, you know, these things take years sometimes. It's not a quick thing. So at least sharing imagery and process, but seeing the actual work, that's the event. And usually those are found on my website, or, you know, I seem to get good Google responses. You know, if you Google my name, you can see like every show I've been in. So I'm fortunate to, you know, be able to track down that easily.
Right.
So I have couple shows coming up. I'll have at the William King Museum in Virginia, and I'm working on another show in New York that'll probably be 2024. Those are the big ones so far.
Well, yeah, once again, thank you. I mean, your work is absolutely beautiful. And I can tell you right now, just seeing people come in, and they're just so amazed by the amount of detail and just duality and the colors, everything. I don't even know where to start. How many people come in and they're like, wow, that's amazing. They did that paper. Like, but like, especially with your artwork being in the same space as like Roberto's work. And so it's just, everything is so dazzling, and you kind of get overwhelmed with all the magical aspects you can make out of paper. So it's definitely an amazing process.
Yeah, it sounds like a great show. I wish I'd have seen all of that. Yeah. It's an honor to be a part of the show. It's a great show.
Definitely glad to have you. That's for sure. So